welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your host, Madelyn.
I'm your host, Emma.
And thanks for tuning in to this week's show. It's a side quest, and it's my turn to pick our topic. And so I've picked Talk This's favorite genre of games, the genre that we play all the time. We're big fans. It's horror games.
Yes.
Did I tease this last time? I know I was like Falling Leaves games, but did I say like horror games? I think I did.
You did.
Okay. I wanted to get that on the record because my boyfriend thinks he came up with this idea, and I don't think he did, but
he might have.
Maybe he did.
Maybe
he's definitely played more horror games than I have. I won't embarrass him by talking about the horror game that he couldn't finish because he was too scared. Maybe we'll see.
Is it even embarrassing? I think Clickbait Boyfriend would probably make it farther in any horror game than I would. So
that's the theme of this episode: is Emma is a baby.
I am just a little baby.
But it's spooky, scary skeleton season, and so we gotta have a Halloween themed episode. And even though it's not yet Halloween, I think it's almost the closest side quest episode to Halloween. And what's the fun of doing one after Halloween, right? By November, it's turkey games.
Yeah. Games
featuring cranberry sauce.
I don't think I will pick that.
Well, you don't like to get on the SEO the same way that I do, so I get it. I'm all about being on trend.
You're right. You gotta hit that sweet, sweet Thanksgiving SEO.
Look, who doesn't like to give thanks?
Probably someone.
You're right. But no, we're talking about horror games. We're talking about how video games explore and implement horror tropes. We're talking about how games might uniquely serve the horror genre, or at least serve it in a different way. How different designers have approached this. The best ways to make a game spooky. Scariest games of all time. It's spooky season.
I'm ready. I'm ready to be spooked.
Well,
she said like a liar.
You put a video at the top. This is the pinnacle of video game horror. What is this?
Have you ever seen, do you know who Jorma is?
Vaguely.
Okay, he's like a streamer. So it's a video from several years ago now of him playing Layers of Fear by Bloober Team, who are ostensibly going to be making the Silent Hill 2 remake. And it's in a hallway, and there's like a child running through the hallway that's like right in front of you. And then when you hit the last one, the ghostly child runs into the wall and like disappears as like a jump scare. Mm-hmm. However, if you go back a few steps and then go forward again, it will trigger the child running into the wall again. And so if you find the loading zone, you can just go back and forth on the loading zone, and infinite children will appear, run into the walls, and vanish.
You know, I can't argue that is the pinnacle of video game horror.
So, that's it. They've made it. The pinnacle. In case you weren't aware yet. Well, you can look it up yourself, because it's very funny, but it is not the pinnacle of video game horror. It's a very bad example of how video games do horror sometimes. And I can't wait to see their take on Silent Hill 2.
More endless children running into walls, no doubt.
Yes.
So let's start with the basics, shall we? What is horror? I feel like horror is the kind of word that I feel like I have to pronounce, the What We Do in the Shadow. Like I have to pronounce like, oh my god, everybody's name is out of my head right now. Like Laszlo. Like I have to give it like a weird. Every time I say it, I have to give it a weird spin. Mm-hmm. From What We Do in the Shadows. I have to be like horror. But I won't do that anymore. Horror. It's a genre, according to Wikipedia, that seeks to elicit fear or disgust in its audience for entertainment purposes. And if you're like me or Emma, you might say, fear or disgust for entertainment purposes? What a dumb idea. But horror has been around basically as long as there have been storytelling, and horror films appear very early in filmmaking, and of course, like, we have gothic literature, and like, there's just horror stuff all over the place, and so it's no surprise that it's something you see in games as well. But games have sort of like particularly kind of I don't know, like a unique genre set, I think, in horror that does not really match up in a one-to-one way with what you think of when you think of like horror films, perhaps. Which was interesting to me. It was interesting to see like certain storytelling things taking precedence in games for reasons that make sense, relative to certain things that are more prevalent in film, right? Like, I don't know, I feel like there's so much in film, the idea of like a bunch of teenagers at a lake and like bad things happen to them kind of films.
I mean, that's what Supermassive specializes in, though. So,
well, I'm not saying there aren't any games like that. I'm just saying survival horror, I feel like, has sort of eaten up the AAA horror space, in a way that like that specific genre is not necessarily quite as like totally at the forefront in film or in literature. It's all murky, of course. There's a lot of overlap. But in games, right, yeah, as we said, we have survival horror, which are things like the most recent and the original Resident Evils, Parasite Eve, Fatal Frame, right? You're like a weak dude trying to get out of a dusty, scary place.
I might put Parasite Eve in action horror, unless I'm really misremembering what that game is like.
You're right. I saw Parasite
She's got like
Eve.
a gun and stuff in that. I guess you do in like Resident Evil 2 as well, but still.
There's, as we'll discuss, there's a lot of overlap across all of these genres, but I think that's fair. You're right. As Emma mentioned, then there's action horror, I describe as action adventure, but with horror. And if you're a listener to the Talk This podcast, you know that action adventure doesn't really mean anything.
No,
so
it really doesn't.
It's like sort of scary action adventure.
Yeah.
There's a real phase of this in sort of like the mid. Well, I'll talk a little bit about some of the phases of like the evolution of horror in games in a little bit. There's a real pivot to these action horror games where it's like you've got a gun and you've got to get out of a dusty, scary place. In kind of the mid 2000s to the mid 2010s or so. So this is, Resident Evil 4 through 6. The Last of Us gets put here. This is part of why this came to mind. I mean, most of why this came to mind for me was Halloween, but The Last of Us that I'm playing and that we talked about on the podcast last week is also broadly mentioned as a horror game, and I think that's wrong. I'm gonna be honest. But in the action horror genre, which itself I sort of think of as like fake horror, I understand why it fits there.
I think that I think of it's interesting because I think of survival horror more as the gameplay elements than like the mood, like in terms of resource management. Like you have to be able to like you have low resources, more than like the tone of it. So I honestly think, especially if you're playing on a higher difficulty, The Last of Us is more of a survival horror than an action horror.
That's interesting. And I like that take. I do not play it on a high enough difficulty for it to feel that way.
I do, still though, when I played it and I just ran out of shotgun bullets, I was like, this is survival horror now. I don't care how many other bullets I have. I don't have my shotgun anymore, so I don't know how I'm supposed to do anything.
I will say, in those moments, maybe some of that goes away. But something that I think of as integral to like core survival horror is the like you're a weak dude, like, and that doesn't have to literally mean that your character is weak, but it's like you're a character that's out of your element,
yeah,
and that isn't necessarily like ready to be an action hero most of the time, or even if they are ready to be an action hero, that's not something that will be beneficial in this particular environment. And again, not to turn this into a second The Last of Us podcast, I promise I won't talk about this the whole time, but I think the dad game actually works against the horror, because necessarily Joel has to feel like sort of in control relative to the AI character. I want to talk about AI characters later too, so it is just going to be a Last of Us podcast.
Great. Looking forward to it.
But I think that's valid. I think that's valid to say on a higher difficulty where your resource management is really at the forefront, that it could turn into that game. Because it is, definitely kind of like freaky. I also just don't find the zombies like that scary. But it's all about what I find scary. So that's the only way to determine the genre.
Yeah.
Anyway, action horror is like, it takes a little bit about like of the elements, I think, of a horror story, but generally the gameplay is not quite, your character is more powerful.
Yeah.
And so many articles I read were like, everybody was like, how do we get that Call of Duty money? And that's where action horror came from. But then we get into things that are more like story based or very mechanics based, right? I feel like survival horror and action horror are pretty big, broad categories. And then we have things like psychological horror, which is more or less what it sounds like, right? Be freaked out, but with your brain, right?
I think I'm always freaked out with my brain, but I get what you're saying.
You understand what I mean. So this is things like Silent Hill or Emma List's Doki Doki Literature Club here. The idea being like more like that dread and that cold sweat than like screaming out loud in fear kind of situation. As opposed to jump scare horror, like perennial child favorite Five Nights at Freddy's, which is all about those like things jumping out at you.
Yeah.
And the genre of reverse horror, which itself is sort of like, well, it's not horror in the same way, like in terms of if you're defining it as what the audience or what the player feels. It's like taking a horror scenario and instead you are the horror.
Yeah.
This is things like Carrion I played like 2 years ago now, which is unbelievable to say, but if you were a listener to the podcast back then, games like Carrion, where you play as the monster slithering through the tunnels and eating people alive, that's a good example of reverse horror. You have some other genres that you threw in here. You're like ready to be the Wikipedia editor. What else have you got?
Because I was thinking like, oh, you know, big horror games, and I was thinking about stuff like Inside or Little Nightmares, which I guess are sort of survival horror or psychological horror. It's like you're a very small little guy in a side-scrolling thing, and it's like quick puzzle solving and running away, which is like feels like a very specific type of horror, even outside of ones where I think it's just that I feel like the mode, like you could separate games horror into also like first person horror, third person horror, side scrolling horror, and those have their own like things that they share, I think, just by how they are presented to you.
I agree with that.
Like I think you're more likely to get like an action horror in a third person horror, and something possibly more psychological in a first person horror.
That makes a lot of sense.
As like general gists. Obviously there are exceptions. Don't at me with all of your exceptions. I get it.
Well, I think survival horror is particularly difficult as a genre because it's been so eaten alive by like Resident Evil that if there's something else that is like in that world but it doesn't feel like Resident Evil, it's like it's like hard to talk about it as survival horror because like RE has just like sucked all the oxygen. Or not even necessarily in a bad way. I just mean like several times throughout like Resident Evil throughout horror games history kind of leads the charge of like it comes out and then everybody makes survival horror games and they decide they're going to do action horror and then everybody's going to make action horror games, and now we're in this phase where they're back to doing survival horror and now everybody wants to do survival horror again. And like of course there are maybe societal reasons why survival horror might be a story that people are interested in right now. I don't know. But like who could say, really? Not me. I don't live in the world. But it does make it like as a genre sort of difficult when you have like such a juggernaut and such a like definitional juggernaut that even though there are other things that feel like they should be part of that genre, it's like it's a Resident Evil Vania. Speaking of which, Castlevania is a horror game? Unbelievable.
The one that they described sounded spooky. I don't think all Castlevanias are horror games just because they have vampires in them. Bloodline sounded like it is spooky.
Hot take. vampires.
I don't think that's a hot
enough.
take. It said that in the list that you.
No, I was just
linked.
joking. It was the vampires thing. Emma says vampires not enough to be a horror game. Cannot just be vampires.
No.
I say cannot just be zombies.
Yeah. Video games also have the unique game co-op games that are horror themed.
Yeah.
So there's Dead by Daylight, which is uses horror aesthetics. It's there's a killer and a bunch of people trying to escape the killer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the game essentially, is those two teams. There's Phasmophobia that people were really into for a while, where you're ghost hunters together and you have to identify the type of ghost. Side note, apparently those devs recently they harbored a racist sex pest in their Discord, so yay. Lovely. Just a side note, throwing that out there. Or even stuff Until Dawn and The Quarry have built-in cooperative modes where everybody can pick the player that the character that they want to play and pass the controller around. So there's this unique thing, obviously, to games versus movies and stuff, where you can you can share a movie experience, obviously, but you can directly share the experience in games.
Well, this is a good little sidebar to my AI or real people question for you. So Emma, let's say I'm theoretically trying to make a horror game, a thing that I would do. And I'm trying to decide whether I should have a cooperative, two-person situation, or whether it should be single player with an AI accompaniment. What do you think would make it scarier?
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of game that you're making.
What a reasonable answer, but you have to weigh in.
I don't know. I think the AI makes it scarier, just by virtue of you can program in scary things with it versus having to rely on players to do stuff.
Okay, so that's an interesting take, because I was talking about this earlier, full disclosure, in the context of The Last of Us, with the idea that, as we'll talk about, Emma and I read a bunch of interviews with horror game developers about kind of how they approach making horror and what they think are elements that make a successful horror game. And one of the things that came up in some of those interviews was the idea that immersion breaking moments in games are bad no matter the game. Yeah. Right? When you encounter glitches in a game, that's bad, right? And providing player agency is a good thing in many different genres of games. But in horror games, avoiding those kinds of immersion breaking moments and providing at least the appearance of player agency are really important to creating those scary moments, right? Because if you have a glitch where I think the interview I was reading, he was the demon dogs can't jump on a table the way that a real dog would. And so if you end up in situations where it would make sense for them to do that, but they're stuck behind the table, then the player isn't scared anymore. They're just laughing at the game.
Yeah.
Right? Or similarly,
children running into walls.
Yes, exactly. Children running into walls. That's the obvious example. Or similarly, if you create a dark tunnel in your game and the player has to go through it, then they don't have a choice. I mean, of course you have to do some of this in games, right? But the comparison here, there's a dark tunnel that you walk by and you have to go through it. The player knows that they have to be able to get through, right? Because it's a game. And the game doesn't end there. They know they have to be able to get through the dark tunnel. And so there's not quite as much uncertainty and there's not quite as much fear because you've given them a little bit of confidence, right? Because they know how games work. As opposed to if there's just a dark tunnel that you can go through or you can't, the player doesn't actually know what's there. Is it instant death? Is there something really scary? Or can they make it through? And so when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about how having an AI character can sometimes fall into kind of both of those traps of first of all, AI characters often don't work perfectly. So sometimes they will do stupid things that are a little bit immersion breaking, right? It's a little hard to feel scared when you're pissed at your character blocking the doorway for you.
I guess, but you could also, I see your argument for this, but just off your initial comparison, I think there's a lot more room for immersion breakingness when you're playing with a buddy.
That's valid. I'll accept that.
When
as a
I'm
counter-argument.
spooked, what will I do? I'll just mash the crouch button so that my character goes bouncy, 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 and then I'm not scared anymore because I can see it doing it near screen or whatever.
Okay,
you know.
So that's valid. Here's my agency side of it. Like, sometimes I won't be scared because my AI character will like walk forward and be fine, or will like open the door or that kind of thing. And because like they will do things that indicate like the game isn't over and they're dead or something like that, like it adds an element of safety that might not be there if it was a real person, because like that real person could be you and they could be a dumb baby. No offense.
Sure. I mean, just like for The Last of Us, for example, though, that's not always true. I'll every time like an AI goes first and I go second, or vice versa, I'm like, it's gonna break. You know, I'm walking across this plank. It's gonna break when I walk across it. It was fine the first. It's gonna break when I do it, and we're gonna get separated. You know, so there's still. I feel like that doesn't actually necessarily break the tension all the time. Either.
That's fair. I've been convinced. I guess what I'm putting out there is horror games are really hard to design. Like, games in general are really hard to design, and horror games just seem to be like.
Well, I think horror is
hard.
just a hard genre to write in general, right? Just in terms of managing your scares, in a lot of cases, making sure you're not, like, accidentally being hateful even, you know?
Yeah.
Like, oops, I made a demon of fat people, you know? Which I feel like happens a lot in a lot
all
of
the
horror.
time.
And so just trying to balancing, like, things being scary versus, like, oops, I made something scary based on, like, societal perceptions. Or something like that. Like, you know, oh, I read Lovecraft. Oops. Oh boy. Stuff like that. So I think it's just a hard genre in general.
Well, it was interesting to me too to start to think about the difference between like, I'm not even exactly sure how to phrase this. Like, the difference in perspective when you're watching a horror movie versus when you're playing a horror game, right? Like, not even just it made me think, honestly, like, critically about the film genre, to be honest, because it's interesting to me to think about the idea that, like, you might sort of be putting yourself in the character's shoes, but, like, the most sort of, like, memeable cultural thing about watching horror movies, right, is the, like, don't go in there kind of like energy, right? That everybody in the movie theater with their popcorn being like, don't go back to the cabin, like, what are you doing, right? Like, that sort of horror. And maybe that's like very like B horror kind of like campy stuff, and I realize that's not what everything is, but I feel like even in like more serious stuff, there's still always that element of you sort of being on the outside being like, this real stupid, you know? Even if it's just a little bit, even if you're also wetting your pants while you're thinking, this real stupid, right? Like, I feel like there's no way to escape that, like, slightly, and that's part of why people like horror, supposedly, according to the pop psychology websites that I looked at, right? Is the idea that you like to feel like you are safer and a little bit smarter than the people on screen.
Sure.
And there's like other things along with it, but like that sense of safety makes it possible for you to enjoy the unpleasant emotions. But in games, like, it's really difficult to create the energy of like, what are you doing? Don't go in there, because like, you are the person. You are going in there.
But see, I feel like that's why I can't play horror games.
Yeah.
Because it's like, I don't want to go in there. Turn the game off. You know?
That's so interesting, because I think of you as a person who has such intense, like, secondhand embarrassment when you're watching media. And so I think of it as being like, there's no way you could watch a horror movie. You'd like get that like secondhand. Well,
I don't watch horror movies, really.
Yeah. But I sort of thought that, like, maybe being the person would alleviate some of that for you. But now you're just saying, no, I'm too smart for that.
Well, it's not really a matter of being too smart. It's just, like, when you go into a horror movie or a horror game, like, you know.
Yeah.
Like, on some level, you're like, okay, like, they're framing this door real spookily with the cinematography. You know? Like, they're telling me it's spooky. I know the character has to go in there because it's the door there, but I don't want to do it. So why would I do that to myself? You know?
Well, that was another interesting, and this doesn't seem to be effective enough for you, but it was interesting to me. So a lot of this stuff is coming from the folks at Frictional Games, who made the Amnesia series, who made Soma, who are, I feel like, if not like as famous as Resident Evil, obviously, are like very well regarded as like creators of really excellent horror experiences, right? They have done a lot of interviews where they've talked about kind of like what lessons they've learned from developing all these horror games and what works and what doesn't. And that was something kind of that they mentioned, that like you would think that creating a horror game where the player kind of plays as themselves would enhance the fear. But the problem is, if the player plays as themselves, they have this impulse like you where they're like, why would I go in there? Right? Like, they don't want to keep going. There's not enough stakes to keep entering the spooky mansion or to continue the dark descent into Amnesia, etc. So you have to create a character that has like enough of a drive to keep going, right? You have to be that Sherlock Holmes. You have to be, I don't know, looking for your dead brother or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and that was interesting to me. I would not have thought of it that way. But now, like, having prepared for this podcast, it's like, oh, that makes complete sense. Because it's like the whole, like, so much of watching movie horror is that like sort of voice in the back of your head of like, these people are doing dumb things. So not that I do a ton of watching movie horror or anything, but yeah.
I mean, just on why I don't play horror games on like a mechanical level too, is I just get shaky when I'm scared, which means that I die, you know? Like, oh boy, I can't press the buttons. That's why I ended up putting down Alan Wake when I was trying to play it, like last year around this time, maybe. I don't know. Was because my hands got so shaky and sweaty on the controller that I just couldn't do it. Like, I wouldn't be able to press the buttons in time because my fingers wouldn't be reacting. And that's not even that scary of a game. But, like, even that, just, like, I cannot physically actually play this anymore. So, unfortunately, horror games will never be for me.
So watch
ones where you need quick reaction time.
Watch the Emma jump scare video game cut on Talk This YouTube coming soon. Yeah.
Also, my dog got concerned when I was playing it frequently. So
does not like horror.
I would just go, ah! And my dog would be like, are you okay?
Oh, you good?
Sniffy, sniff, sniff. Okay. I'm like, Molly, I'm trying to dodge this attack right now, and my hands are shaking, and now you're sniffing me.
She looks concerned right now, to be honest. She's like, I remember that time. That was not good.
She remembers it. They can smell fear, probably.
Yeah. She's like, I'm not a demon dog.
Demon dog.
It was interesting to me, so much of the stuff about, like, how you design good horror games, it's just like, why would you ever do this to yourself? Like, this just sounds impossible. Like, all the developer interviews that I read were like, you know, it's a game, so, like, I guess it has to be fun, but fun kind of works against horror, you know? So, like, you kind of have to make your systems hard to use and kind of vague and confusing, and, like, it really can't be that fun. It's just so weird. It's so antithetical, right?
I guess. I mean, I always say that I think there's a difference between, like, fun and satisfying, right?
Right.
So there is a feeling of, like, satisfaction or catharsis when you, like, close the door on the monster, you know, and you're safe for a little bit. That is fun, I guess. Even if it's not exactly like, haha, zombies, bang, 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 fun.
Exactly. But it's just got to be so hard to do, right? And, like, again, it's like in most games, you don't want a lot of time where you're just, like, walking around and nothing happens, right?
Right.
In horror, you have to have, like, 90% of the game be, like, you're walking around and nothing happens.
Yeah.
Or the scares don't work.
Yeah.
Which is wild. That sounds impossible.
It's all about that tension, Madeline.
I know it's all about that tension. I get it. I get it in theory. I'm just like, goodness gracious, is making a game not hard enough? Or like, they all talk about, they're like, okay, so like, your gameplay can't be fun. So the only thing you've got here is narrative, right? Like, it can't be a fun game, so the narrative's got to be good, right? And plenty of these developers are like, so much of this stuff is too surface level, like, we could be doing more, right? But they're like, you gotta have narrative, but you can't use cutscenes. No cutscenes. It's just like, why are you playing, like, you're playing this game on like survival, your game development survival horror here.
I mean, I think that all of them break the rule of no cutscenes, to be fair.
I mean, I know.
I think it's key to not, like, have the cutscenes not remove yourself from the game too much, right? So, like, if you're in a first-person horror game, it shouldn't, like, suddenly go third-person for a cutscene or anything like that.
Right.
But, like, all horror games use cutscenes.
I know. But it was interesting to, I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, right? That, like, necessarily, I mean, this is the complaint about cutscenes in, like, any game, right? Is they kind of, like, break the flow, right? But, and of course you can still probably do, like, a jump scare in a cutscene, but it takes you back into that, like, movie space where that agency goes away, where, like, the tension kind of comes out of your hands a little bit. I'm not saying people don't use them. I'm just saying it was notable to me that people kind of said, you really have to de-emphasize this, because if you do too much of it,
well,
it just, like, starts to be a movie.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me, you know, it seems like horror is kind of, like, on the ascendant right now, right? Like, with the Resident Evils, you know, the continued perpetual cultural relevance of PT and Silent Hill potentially coming back as a genre that, like, in games has sort of always existed a little more to the outskirts. It'll be interesting to see, like, where this current wave is going.
Well, I know Resident Evil Village 8, whatever, took a step more back towards action horror. I mean, like, the first thing you do is, like, shoot a giant flying lady, like, 100 times.
That is actually the only requirement of a horror game, is there has to be a tall woman.
That is the modern one. Yeah, I think that's the modern video game need, is if you want to sell copies, you do have to have a tall lady.
I was gonna ask, like, what do you think it says about us that, like, the tall woman is, like, the scariest thing that we can come up with? But
I don't think people think she's scary, is the thing.
Well, I know that. I remember. Did I already tell the story on the podcast of, like, Resident Evil comes up on the Nintendo Direct and Quick Boyfriend is watching and he's just like, he reports back to me later. He's just like, the whole comment section is just, mommy.
Yeah,
mommy.
you did.
Okay. That's my survival horror.
The true horror. The horny internet.
Honestly, make a horror game about the internet. More horror games with the internet. I know that there are, like, some, like, computer-based games. But I do think, so, like, talking a little bit about kind of, like, the broad progression of the horror genre in games, right? In the 80s and 90s, it starts out as, like, it's sort of like before people realized survival horror is the only thing that they should design. I'm just kidding, but not totally kidding. It's mostly just, like, licensed games based on horror movies. So not even really horror games, to be honest. They're just, like, they exist in horror worlds. And then Resident Evil and Silent Hill come out, and everyone's like, oh, it's a golden age. It's survival horror. We must make Resident Evil. And then everybody wants that Call of Duty money, like I said. So the mid-2000s becomes, like, the action horror zone, right? Those Resident Evil 4 through 6, Dead Space, Alan Wake, I think falls somewhat into this genre. And then from the mid-2010s, you know, with all of this kind of action horror, there's a space for indie developers to really kind of, like, seize the interesting horror scene, right?
Yeah, if you're looking, still even now with, like, a resurgence of scary horror in big budget games. If you're looking for like weird or really scary stuff, you're probably better looking at indie stuff for a variety of different types of horror.
Which I think is really what it comes down to. I don't know. I know that like not all the Resident Evils are the same. Like not all of these games are the same, right? They're not. But it's interesting to me that like in the sort of like big budget space, it just all of a sudden has kind of a similar, like a lot of it has quite similar vibes. And it's really only when you kind of get into the indies that you start to get like playing around more with the genre, because I feel like in the big budget stuff, it's like either it's like sort of medieval, even if it's not actually medieval, it's like you're in a castle-y situation, right? Or it's like you're in space. And there's not that much in between that.
I do wonder how much of it I assume not too much, is like having like the marketable monster, you know? Like being able to be like, you know, this is our scary monster. Please buy the figurine. You know? Or please draw art of our scary monster. Or stuff, like having something sort of recognizable, I guess. Not even from like a selling perspective, but being able to market it, right? Like being like, this is our monster or a monstrous character that's memorable and will stick in your mind. But that by having like an identifiable monster in a lot of like the AAA stuff that I can think of, it sort of brings itself in, like it boxes itself into a particular genre of horror, you know?
Yeah. I mean, you've traded some of the fear, right? The more of that you reveal the in advance, the more iconic you make like any sort of scary character, supposedly scary character in your game, right? You know, it probably helps drive sales, but you have made a real trade-off there with like how scary, you know, I'm not going to find Lady D that's scary, and I mean people do, of course, she's still scary in the game, but I'm not going to find her as scary as I may have if I hadn't had all of Nintendo's fanboys screaming mommy in the chat every time she appears.
I mean, all that being said, I do think there's room in games for like funny horror. I don't know, like
but there's just not a lot of that. It's something that really does exist in movies.
All of Resident Evil is kind of funny horror, you know?
I mean, that's fair. Yes, of
like,
course.
yes, like, Mr. X is scary, but also he's really funny. You know? He's like this big guy with, like, a fedora on. Follows you around.
Do you think they're doing that on purpose, though?
Well, I mean, Mr. X is from the original. So, right. I don't know.
I'm just wondering. I'm like,
I mean, Resident Evil has, like, the most funny lore. So,
yeah.
I don't know if they're doing it on purpose, but certainly part of the brand. They're doing it on purpose with whatever intention that they have. I don't know what that is, but
I guess I just wonder, like, yeah, Resident Evil does have this element of campiness to it, which is sort of impressive, because that's like the kind of thing that feels hard to pull off. Like, I feel like camp horror in film does really mostly work. I keep saying this stuff with like so much authority. Like, I don't watch that like almost any horror, but like it seems to me that camp horror on film should work because of that audience removal, right? Like, you're able to kind of laugh at it and occasionally find it scary, and that feels like the kind of thing that might get ripped to shreds in a game, right? And Resident Evil has like the cred to do it, but like you're creating an even like thinner line for yourself to walk, so it's like particularly impressive.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's what Supermassive is doing. It's their brand, so
that's fair enough. But I do think, I mean, I really think where horror games are going is just like more games using elements of horror, and like probably fewer quote unquote horror games in the mainstream. More The Last of Us. Well, who knows? I mean, I don't know. Like, everybody's resurrecting their horror series, so I'll eat my words. But it just seems like these kinds of things.
I don't have any faith in any resurrection of Silent Hill, I'll just say.
Yeah, okay. I mean, true. You don't think they're going to make PT, Emma? You don't think that they're going to make
I don't want Bluebird Team's take on PT. I don't want it. They'll just have children running into walls.
This whole episode is just me being like, man, these are hard. But like, I also think horror games are hard because, of course, as we talk about on the show all the time, it's a difficult, toxic world out there for games that are short. Mm-hmm. And not all horror games are short, but many of them work better as contained experiences. And one could argue that the reason that Lost Demo PT remains so culturally iconic is that it was this very contained, very successful horror experience that didn't have time to get too big and get boring. Another thing that seems to be particularly challenging about horror games is it's like, at a certain point, you've used too many you've run out of your jump scare budget, right? And at a certain point, the player gets used to the monsters. Or another interesting take from one of these interviews is like, the player tries to ruin the experience for themselves. By which I mean, the player wants to be scared. That's why they're playing your game. But they also really don't want to be scared because being scared is unpleasant. Yeah. So even though they have this like super objective of being scared, moment to moment, they do not want to be afraid. And so because of that, like in any game that has any ability to fight the monsters, right? The player will try to figure out more and more efficient ways to like destroy the monsters and therefore not be scared. But once they do that, then they don't get scared anymore and they're sad that they haven't been scared. So it's this weird, like, circular dilemma of, like, you really want to be scared, but, like, moment to moment, you don't want to be scared. And so, like, yeah.
I think that's, like, as much as Village is campy from what I've watched of it, there is a lot of advantage to, like, there are 4 distinct zones, right?
Yeah.
Like, you finish one before you get the chance to be like, okay, Lady D, I get it. You're following me around laughing. Yeah. And then you're on to the next zone to, like, learn about that monster. And then by the time you're done with it, you do the last bit. And it's like, okay, you know, I'm done with this zone. On to the next one. And they're each, like, their own, like, flavor of horror. So that the player is able to be continuously spooked without something growing too stale. Which I think is a good design decision.
It's got to be why American Horror Story doesn't, like, just does, like, is an anthology show. Not that I watch that show either, but yeah.
I think it would be really hard to make, like, a really long-running horror TV show that's not an anthology, you know?
Yeah.
Like, is Stranger Things scary anymore? I don't know. I didn't watch past the first season, but it doesn't seem like it would be.
I didn't care for Stranger Things.
But at a certain point, it's like, it moves out of, like, scariness and more to, like, action stuff because you understand more about what's going on, and so it's not quite as scary anymore.
So, circling back all this to say that it can be a tough world out there for short games, and it can be especially a tough world out there for short games that are priced like AAA games.
Yeah.
And so, it does make it hard to see horror games, like, as pure horror games ever really reigning ascendant, right? Like,
yeah, that's a good point. You can't make, well, you probably can't make, like, an open world horror game. I think the Evil Within 2 is maybe open world in horror.
I think so.
I think Alan Wake 2 is going to be at least more open than the first game.
I'm feeling like we went to a PAX panel on this at some point.
They talked about the Evil Within 2, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly what they said about, like, the open worldness of it.
I sort of remember it being like, it's more successful than it really should be.
Yeah. Because it doesn't feel like it should be, right?
Yeah.
Because horror is so dependent on pacing, and open world is so, like, let the player go where they want to go.
Yeah.
That it feels like that should not marry together well, particularly.
Oh, that's why, like, one of these articles was like, maybe procedural generation could be a direction for this. And even the article was like, probably not, though. But it's just like, that could never, it just does not seem like it could ever work. So maybe if there's a backlash to the open world, trend, if you can even call it a trend, then horror games could swoop in.
It's not procedurally generated, I don't think exactly, but I know the game called The Mortuary Assistant just came out, where it's like you have like 3 bodies and you have to identify which one of them is possessed by a demon and burn it with like the correct sigil by identifying the demon while scary things are happening. And to add to the replayability, the bodies are different each time. So that you can play it again and again. And not just be like, well, I know it's this body this time. You have to like figure it out each time, which isn't exactly procedural generation because it's like, it's still the same formula. It's a very limited amount of it, but it just makes sure that even if you want to replay it, you're still having to go through the scary bits as opposed to having totally conquered it.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. But even that sort of thing seems like it has like very limited applications.
Yeah.
To like a crafted experience. Like it's interesting as like adding some replayability. But that's another thing, right? I mean, whatever. As we talked about on whatever side quest this was relevant to, like nobody actually replays their games, right? It's a tiny percentage of players that actually do this. So like you probably shouldn't care about it. But given that it's like out there in the conversation, horror games also not great to replay. For all the reasons that we've discussed.
Yeah.
So it's tough.
I do see the benefit of that, like specifically, like if you had puzzles in your horror game.
Yeah.
If you could add some element of randomization in case anyone was like, oh, like I'm too scared for this part, so I'm gonna watch a walkthrough, and I'll be like, no, you fool, you have to do it. Yeah. That would get me. I'd turn off the game. Sorry.
I won't go too much into this. I didn't do like too much reading about it, but man, horror games, like the one area where it's like, no, like this is easy, right? Most of making horror games is like, this is really hard, right? Like hard to craft the story, hard to get that tension release cycle correct, hard to make the player not just want to like turn around and hide, etc., etc. Hard to make a monster that is both iconic enough to sell some merch, but vague enough to be scary, etc. Hard to make a game that intentionally should not be that fun most of the time. But man, probably more than like many games, especially in kind of an indie space, a horror game with some good jump scares in it, probably like way easier. Not to say it's easy, right? All of this in the realm of it's still very, very hard. They're probably way easier with a good little horror game to get some streaming pickup than just like any random action adventure-y type thing.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's good entertainment value to watch someone else be scared, It's adding another level of disconnect where you really can just be like, find it a little bit funny, Yeah. Like watching someone else be scared at scary things. It's like, it
turns it back into a movie again.
Yeah, it does a little bit, yeah.
Which is so interesting.
But yeah, having like the horror game is definitely like streamers, especially like variety streamers, of course, are always looking for like the thing that will entertain their audience. And I think that horror intrinsically has that sort of entertainment value. So if you're willing to torture yourself for your audience's money, that's just streaming in general, to be fair.
So. Basically. Look, I'll put up one recommendation for horror games. At least one article I read said that horror content can facilitate feelings of romance and social bonding. So
it's you should invite suspension bridge effect, right?
Yes. So you should invite your crush over to play 5 Nights at Freddy's.
It's just like when you go through danger with someone, it like heightens your emotional response. That's what the suspension bridge effect is. So it's like faking that, because obviously you're not actually in danger, but it's still like heightening the emotional connection there faster.
On the negative side of things, people who like horror have lower empathy ratings So if someone invites you over to play Five Nights at Freddy's with them, they may not have much empathy.
Well, all that really means is, like, how much you, like, put yourself directly in someone else's shoes, right?
Sure.
It doesn't mean you're not a kind person.
Relationship with someone with low empathy?
It doesn't mean you're not a kind person. I think that low empathy also means, like, you would have less secondhand embarrassment, for instance.
Right. That's fair. I'm really just kidding. That was just a joke. People can like horror and they don't have to be, like, serial killers. That's not what I'm saying. I thought it was funny. That was just a joke.
Yeah.
Well, Emma, do you have any final horror thoughts?
The only 2 horror games
that was a jump scare.
That really got me. You got me.
Had to have one. Go on. The only 2 horror games.
Well, actually, I think I finished Detention. The Red Candle games are, like, the only horror games that I've attempted to finish. I did finish Detention, which is their first one. I don't think I finished Devotion. I think I had to put it down and watch the rest. Because it's like a PT, like, sort of, where like you're in first person. It's the one that was banned from Steam because of the Winnie the Pooh they left in it. Do you remember that?
Right, I do remember the Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah, they released it on their online store a couple years ago. And I bought it there and started it, and I don't think I finished it. And like, so you're in first person, and like there's different apartments that represent different years, and like they change as you do things in the different years. So it's that similar idea of PT, of like going around the hallway and things are different each time, right? But with a little bit of timeline messiness added to it. It was very scary. I liked it a lot, and I didn't like it a lot. So those are my 2 horror games. And I played Spell and Wake. I think those are the only 3, like, really, like, genuinely, like, this is scary games that I've played. So.
I really think I played less than that. I mean, I played Carrion, which is reverse horror. It was a little freaky at first, but not that scary. Kingdom Hearts is a horror game when you really think about it, right?
Mm-hmm. I do scream whenever Michael Mouse appears on screen.
Right? Michael Mouse is a jump scare.
Sphere.
Anytime a new Disney character appears, it's a jump scare, basically.
Yeah.
Anytime Jiminy Cricket hops out. Anyway, I'll close up there. Listeners, thanks for tuning in for another episode of Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
Do you have a favorite horror game? Do you like horror as a genre? Do you avoid it? Are you somewhere in between? Do you have a favorite Resident Evil? Do you feel like there's a genre of horror we missed? Or like a foolproof way to have a great horror game that isn't just a tall woman? If you have thoughts on any of that or anything else that we discussed this week, hit us up on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games that are in the hat, and read our blog featuring long-running series Clickbait Boyfriend and Split Screen. If I was a smarter person, I would have written a Games That Remind Me of Falling Leaves blog. Who knows? Maybe I have written it. I probably haven't, though, but I wish I had. Maybe by the end of the autumn.
No, it's just, she's smart enough, but she's just too busy to really ponder what games represent the falling leaves. Like, that takes some serious thinking, like thesis level consideration.
I would have flower on there, like a petal. It's kind of similar.
Yeah.
Probably like a Stardew Valley, like something that has like an autumn vibe. Anyway, I won't spoil the blog that I will not ever write. But finally, and most importantly, if you enjoyed the show, you should subscribe. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, wherever you can find podcasts, wherever you found the podcast today. Subscribe to Talk This. Next week we are talking about some games.
We're talking about
Neon White.
Yep.
And the old game.
Gran Turismo.
Not really horror games, unless Neon White is. I still don't know what that game is.
Or if you're scared of driving.
if you're scared of cars.
Some people are, I think that's a legit fear.
That's something we didn't talk about, the, like, like no spider modes or whatever, but...
That's not really horror games. That's, like, a different...
Turns a game into a horror game.
We weren't just talking about fear in games.
You know what? I take it back. The Last of Us is a horror game. It has too many just rats running around. Every time there's a rat, it's a jump scare for me.
They would live in the apocalypse, the rats.
I know they would. I feel like once I've seen them once, you don't have to show them again. I know they're there. This is my survival horror. It's a room with rats. Anyway, listeners, thanks for tuning in as always. Emma, do you have a spooky sign-off?
This week, I hope that you are able to go indoors normally.